This is the WealthAbility for CPAs show. Better clients, better practice, better life. Here's Tom Wheelwright.
Welcome to the WealthAbility show for CPAs, where we're always discovering how to build better clients, a better practice, and a better life. Hi, this is Tom Wheelwright, your host, founder, and CEO of the WealthAbility Network. All right, so the Democrats have the White House. They have both houses of Congress. Now what? So that is the big question on everybody's mind. I'm very pleased to have back with us Joe Thorndike. Joe's the director of the Tax History Project at Tax Analysts. As y'all know, that's a nationally recognized, the authoritative journal on taxation, and particularly the history of taxation. Joe's also a prolific author, and his latest book is Their Fair Share, Taxing the Rich in the Age of FDR. So never has that topic, Joe, I don't know that you ever thought that topic would be quite as relevant as it is today, but welcome, Joe Thorndike.
Hey, it's great to be here again.
So if you would, just for those people who don't know you, remind us a little bit about your background and how you got into being a tax historian.
Honestly, I ask myself that question all the time. And I'm not the only one. You know, there are a few others out there. But I actually, I started in tax, and then I went into history, and then I came back to tax, is sort of the trajectory for me. But when I came back to tax, I stuck with the history. So I started out working for Tax Notes a million years ago, right out of college, strangely, and then left Tax Notes, went to graduate school in American history, and then came back when I was writing my dissertation, which turned out to be about taxes. And Tom Field, the founder of Tax Analysts, hired me to come back and write about history for Tax Notes. So I've been doing that now for 26 years or something like that at Tax Notes.
You know, honestly, I know this sounds a little nerdy, but I think that sounds like a great job and a great opportunity. You know, I think we talked before, and I was in Washington, D.C. during 1986, 1985, 86, and 87. And so I was in the national office of Ernst & Young back then, back when it was Ernst & Winnie. And, you know, that was a big part of tax history. And of course, you know, what happened after that, you know, there's a lot of history in that too. So given your background, given what you know, the big question on everybody's mind is, how much can Joe Biden get through? He's got a $3 to $4 trillion tax plan that he would like to impose. He'd like to tax the rich. They've only got a 50-50 majority. You know, it's a 50-50, but they have a majority by one, right? By virtue of the vice president. What do you think? What do you see happening? And then let's talk about when you might see it happening.
Yeah. Well, I think this majority is important for the Democrats. I do not think it's as important as some Democrats think it is. You know, I see an awful lot of stuff on Twitter. And so let's give them this, like those Georgia Senate races were a big surprise, right? I certainly didn't think it was going to turn out that way. None of the handicappers really did. It was a big surprise. And the Democrats were elated for all of about 12 hours until we had last Wednesday at the Capitol, which sort of evaporated all the elation. But, you know, then the problem is that a lot of Democrats were like, oh, well, now we're going to do everything. And you see it especially around environmental policy. And there's stuff on Twitter. They're like, now there are no excuses. And I'm like, well, there are actually great excuses. And the great excuses are basically the filibuster, right? It actually takes 60 votes in the Senate to do anything meaningful most of the time. That's not true about taxes. That's the thing, right? So for tax policy, for tax changes, you actually can do stuff with just 50 votes plus one. So it is possible that Biden and the Democrats are going to be able to get some of their tax agenda over the line. And that's different than most of the Democratic agenda.
So what do you think? So what do you think they will be able to get over the line, and what's keeping them from getting more of it over the line?
All right. So like I said, it takes 60 votes to get most legislation over the line, but there is a way around it for tax policy. You can use the reconciliation process. And I mean, it is way too arcane to try to get very far into it right now. But basically, it's a budget process that allows the majority party to pass a budget resolution and then a reconciliation bill that that basically implements the budget resolution. And so let's say that the budget resolution says that they need to pass, this amount of new spending and this amount of new taxes, and then they can pass a bill that does those things. And that bill, that implementing legislation, can't be filibustered. It can be passed by just 50 votes plus one. So they get a good shot at it, right? So let's say the tax parts of that, they can get a tax bill over the line with just that 50 vote majority plus Kamala Harris's vote. That gives them basically one bite at the apple. They're going to get one.
All right, that's the question. I mean, how often can they do that reconciliation process?
Is
it once a year?
Basically once a year. I mean, it's technical, and they could pass a second budget resolution in theory, but they don't do that. They can pass 3 reconciliation bills, but they can each reconciliation bill, one of them can do tax, one of them can do spending, one of them can do the budget, the debt limit. But you can only touch each of those topics once. And what happens sometimes is they pass one bill and it touches all the spending stuff and barely touches a little bit of the tax. And then they want to go back and do tax again. Nope, you've already touched tax a little bit, can't touch it at all again. So basically, you got to be careful. You get one bite at the apple. So they're going to get one shot at passing tax legislation using the reconciliation process. And let's just establish right now that most tax legislation will not pass outside of reconciliation, unless it's a big tax cut of some sort. And let's just bracket that and say there probably is some tax legislation that could pass outside reconciliation because it's a tax cut. Biden does have certain tax cuts that he's supported, particularly at the low end, some refundable tax credits, which might get support. It's possible to imagine that. But especially these tax increases, those are not going anywhere except possibly through reconciliation. And even there, it's going to be a heavy lift because there are certain people in the Senate who are going to be hard to convince. And in particular, the name that everyone needs to keep in mind, Joe Manchin, the blue senator from a red state. He's a senator from West Virginia. He is not going to be an easy sell on any tax increase. He might be willing to take some, but he's, for instance, on the estate tax, he has voted for repeal of the estate tax in the past. So he is not going to be an easy sell.
Well, so let's look at some of these things. So we kind of break down Biden's tax wishes. Okay, we can break them down into rate increases, right? We can break them down into shifts in incentives, and we can break them. And then there's the estate tax. So what I'm hearing is, okay, hopefully we can put the estate tax to bed. We'll hopefully we can rely on the senator from West Virginia to avoid that. So what do you think is, what's likely to pass in this first reconciliation bill?
Well, so all right, I spent some time thinking about this. I did a little reading around. I've been trying to see what the smart people think. The Wall Street Journal ran something the other day that said, there's a much better chance that Biden's going to be able to pursue his agenda. And I was like, yeah, what did they say? I think it was like a much stronger possibility. And I was like, well, much stronger in the sense that like 20% is more than 0%. I think that there is, I think the best chances are the tax cuts, are like the refundable tax credits for childcare and for home buying and for retirement savings. The chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee is in favor of new retirement savings incentives. I think some of those sorts of things stand a pretty good chance because you've got a pretty good chance of getting most Republicans on board for most kinds of tax cuts. Refundable tax credits are controversial sometimes.
Right. What about, for example, the the climate type credits and the climate incentives, things like renewable energy and solar and that kind of thing? Do you see that having to be in the reconciliation bill, or do you think they'll be able to get 60 votes for that?
The politics on that shift a lot all the time. You can sometimes find Republican votes for that. It really, and often that depends on the broader political forces in play. Often the parties decide that they are not interested in delivering victories to the other party for any reason. And that just happens all the time. And so the Republicans may decide that they're just not interested in helping the Democrats over the line on anything right now. Or they may decide they are. And I mean, let's just say that the politics in Washington are very fluid at this moment, right? We don't know. And I mean, as a historian, I've never seen a moment like this. And we're in the midst of what's going to be a second impeachment in any moment. And how that's going to play out, we don't really know. There are probably going to be some Republican votes for that impeachment, which is not the same it was as before. How that is going to play out, we don't know. There are a group of senators, which is bipartisan, and we don't know, but they're in the middle, they're in the sort of the middle of the ideological spectrum. How those people are going to vote, we don't know. So I don't know, those sorts of credits could conceivably find a constituency. So I do think there's a possibility that some of those green energy credits could find votes in a way that they could not, say, during parts of the Obama administration. I can imagine a bipartisan moment for, say, early in the Biden presidency. I could also imagine that this impeachment drive poisons the well in such a way that we have no bipartisan movement at all. So it is too early to tell. I mean, you're asking me this week, and I think maybe in 2 weeks we'll have a much better idea, but it's hard to say right now.
So the last time you were on the show, we talked about MMT, magic money theory. That's how I refer to it anyway. And that's the Democrats' platform right now. So under that theory, you don't need taxation to spend. So the only reason, presumably, for taxation is either to incentivize or disincentivize, right? Or to punish, right? And so where do you think the Democrats will go with that? Let's say the Democrats, do this, they'll do a reconciliation bill. We all expect that. And they will put their tax wish list in there. What do you think they can get by their own senators that would pass in that reconciliation bill?
I can't imagine that any kind of MMT scale policy set of policy proposals is in serious consideration at this point. I mean, this is way too moderate. It's way too close, right? The Senate majority is way too small. The House majority is really small. You have members of the House Democratic Caucus like Abigail Spanberger from Virginia, I'm spacing on his name right now. He's from Pennsylvania. But in any case, there are a lot of very moderate Democrats who are not in the House who are not going to go for that. So
but let's take the pandemic on top of this, right? So there's this huge feeling of we need to take care of people, and that because of this pandemic. And so, Biden's already talking about a $2 to $3 trillion additional stimulus bill for the pandemic. Could they not use that as their mechanism to get some of these tax increases?
I do think, I don't think you'll see that. I don't think they'll use tax increases in that moment. I think that is where the MMT style spending might actually happen. I mean, so, it was President Trump who suggested the $2,000 checks, and you might find a constituency for that. I mean, certainly President-elect Biden has endorsed that idea. There's pretty broad support for that idea.
Vice President-elect Harris has suggested $2,000 a month.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this is universal basic income that she's talking about, and not replacing any other programs, which of course is, I'm actually okay with the idea of universal basic income if we got rid of all the welfare programs, right? It probably would be cheaper to have universal basic income than it would to have all the welfare programs. But she suggested having $2,000 a month, at least through the end of the pandemic. She wanted to go back in August. She was talking about going back to March and actually catching people up on $2,000 a month. So, I mean, is that possible? I mean, could we see that size? I mean, that would be enormous. Could we see that?
Joe Manchin is never going to vote for that. Neither is John Tester. Neither are your Arizona senators.
No, they're not. I don't think they will.
There are 4 Democrats right there who are never going to vote for that. And Joe Manchin has already said he doesn't support a $2,000 stimulus payment. I think he's soft on that opposition, but he's never going to support something bigger than that. So I would think that again. So what are we going to see? I think we'll probably see a spending package that comes through pretty. I think it's possible we see a spending package, a pandemic relief package pretty early in this Biden presidency. And that may include a number of sort of progressive priorities. It may include some of these refundable tax credits and things like that. It may include changes to the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, the Democrats are very eager to make, and could be, easily sort of thematically bundled in with a pandemic relief bill. So I think that that's where some of the progressive priorities might be made, might be included, because that's going to be the problem that Biden's going to have, right? Is that there's going to be a lot of pressure on him for things like the Green New Deal,
right?
That he's not going to have the money for or the support for in the Senate. And what is he going to do? He can't say no to everything they want, right? He's got a problem on his left. So he's got to find something to give them. And I think that some of that may come in the form of like direct spending in the pandemic bill.
Well, and then another question is, of course, President Trump used executive order for tax policy. We saw he used it for unemployment. I think everybody forgets that the reason they had unemployment for an additional 4 months was because of an executive order. So will Biden use an executive order? He's already said he's going to undo a lot of Trump's executive orders. Will he use that himself, and can he use that to enact some of this additional policy and do some of these things that perhaps the left wants done?
Yeah, I mean, the presidency, I think we have seen has in the last two presidencies, we've seen that the presidency actually is quite powerful. But I would be surprised. Many of these progressive priorities are quite expensive, and you can't just manufacture the money out of thin air. As President Trump discovered with the wall, it was hard for him to come up with the money for that because you can't just create it. He was able to redirect some money toward it, but he wasn't able to come up with as much money as he wanted. So in truth, it is difficult to just create things out of thin air as the president. So I would be surprised. I do think one thing that's possible, especially in tax, is that Congress might try to roll back a lot of tax regulations early on. They have that capacity to roll back a lot of the ones that have been enacted since this summer. But as my colleague Marty Sullivan recently pointed out, that's not easy either. Congress can roll those things back one at a time, but it's very difficult for them, and it constrains them a lot.
Well, I mean, are you thinking are there tax regulations? My experience with the current IRS and Treasury have been the tax regulations haven't exactly been taxpayer friendly. So they can roll them back, but will that actually help them?
Well, I mean, they might. Marty's view is that some of them are taxpayer friendly, and actually that would make it difficult to roll them back because a lot of Democrats won't be inclined to roll them back because they have constituents who like them. But in any case, it's cumbersome because they have to roll them back one at a time. Each of them has to be debated for a long time on the floor, and then it constrains them from enacting new regulations on the same topic. And so they're not going to want to do it. So, but they did it at the end of the Obama administration. The Republicans in Congress rolled back a lot of the Obama regulations. So, it's one way in which the Democrats might try to change, a lot of Republican priorities, but only the recent ones. So, I don't know that will happen either.
So let me ask this question. So. To me, one of the most important parts of this win for the Democrats in Georgia is that bills come to the floor that Chuck Schumer wants, not that Mitch McConnell wants. And so it seems to me like we'll get bills at least debated on the floor, and there will be a political will to debate them, even if they don't get passed, perhaps when Chuck Schumer seems to take a lot of direction from Nancy Pelosi. And so we're going to see, it seems to me, more bills coming to the floor. One of Nancy Pelosi's primary targets has been the $10,000 cap on the state and local income tax. Do you think that will come to the floor. Do you think that's a possibility of being repealed?
I think that that's not out of the question. And Chuck Schumer's from New York. I mean, he's
Yeah, and Nancy Pelosi's from California, right? So
there are definitely a lot of Democrats who like the idea of repealing that cap. And there are a lot of progressive Democrats who think that's a terrible idea, right? Because it's not a progressive policy.
right.
I would not be surprised to see them try to roll that in because it's taxpayer friendly, right? And it's hard to see that would be it wouldn't be broadly unpopular, right? Because there's not going to be people in the streets complaining about that. That's a wonkish complaint, right? That's like the Urban Institute and the Brookings Institution are going to complain about that, but not regular taxpayers because it's not this.
No, it's a policy issue as opposed to a practical issue, because practically people are going to go, well, I want more deduction. Nobody tends to turn down tax deductions. Let me ask you one more question, because the one area that I've always felt they might be able to get through is raising the top rate. To Joe Biden's back to the 39.6%. I've always felt like 40% is a magic number, and that they've been very careful not to broach that 40% rate, and they've stayed underneath that 40% rate. Do you think that that's a legitimate possibility of, if that's all they do is just raising the rates of people over $400,000, which is Joe's target?
I mean, I think it's not a big hike. It's only a couple of percentage points that they're looking for on that, as opposed to, say, raising the corporate rate from 21 back to 28, which would be an enormous change back in the other direction, right? I think that's much less likely. This returning the top rate to where it used to be seems to me like an easier lift. But in general, let's remember where the Democrats won this election. They won this election in the suburbs, and
that's right.
So my guess would be that they're not going to antagonize the suburbs more than they have to, which is one reason why removing the cap on property taxes is probably popular for them, and something that they like because that does well in the suburbs. And who lives in suburbs? People who are doing relatively well, right. The kind of people who are going to not be interested, who might care about that top rate. So I would be in the constellation of things that might happen. I would put a hike in the top rate as relatively low. And in a world where they aren't going to be able to get many of these priorities across the line, right? I think that that's relatively unlikely. I don't really think there are going to be that many tax increases happening, mostly because we are in a relatively unstable economic situation. It's not a great economic moment. There are arguments to be made. John Maynard Keynes made them, that you can tax people in a recession and it's okay. The economy might even do better. But in general, most economists don't counsel that as good advice. Don't take that as good advice these days. And I think, discretion is the better part of valor, and they will not choose to go that route. Better to just spend the money. They're just going to cut taxes in certain places. And I don't see them trying to antagonize people like that right now. They've got bigger fish to fry.
Well, and speaking of that, so let's talk about those bigger fish just for a minute before we wrap up here. We know that President-elect Biden has talked about immigration and immigration reform. Of course, President Trump did a lot of that by executive order. They did it by regulation. Certainly, there's been a lot of regulation rollback on the climate, and presumably we will see those regulations come back on the climate. We'd certainly expect the Paris Climate Accord we'll sign back onto that. Who knows, we'll sign back onto the Iran deal. These aren't really tax issues, but they have financial consequences to them. So, that you do have this question, do we have to fund it? And that's the fundamental question. Do we have to fund anything we do from a immigration standpoint? Do we have to fund, for example, if we do one of President-elect Biden's primary targets, of course, is national health care and a public option. And does that come along, does that come in a reconciliation bill? Because that's not going to come outside of a reconciliation bill. What do you think? What do you think, just more broadly, the Democrats can get through?
That would be a pretty heavy lift for the first year. I mean, well, let's look, and we're really talking about 1 year here, because by the time we get into next year, everybody's going to be in full-on campaign mode. Right. In 2022, there's not going to be any major legislation moving. So we're really talking about this year. And the problem with this year is that the pandemic overshadows everything. And I think that the administration is in all likelihood going to be mostly concerned with getting vaccines out and into people's arms and an inadequate supply. So it's kind of implausible to me that they're going to try something as controversial as a public auction. I mean, maybe they lower the Medicare age to 60, which is broadly popular. Polls,
or they could raise the Medicaid, income level.
They make Medicaid. They expand Medicaid, which is also generally polls fairly well. But I mean, a public option would be much harder than both of those things. And of course, Medicare for all is ridiculously hard to.
It's a non-starter. Yeah.
So I don't see that stuff happening. I think this year is going to be eaten up by just the nuts and bolts of trying to get the vaccine out and trying to get the country moving out of this thing, because we are a long way from being back to normal. And I just think that's why I'm actually pretty dubious about any tax increases, because it's just risky. I think you see some effort in that direction to try to make the progressive side of the party reasonably happy, but not at the expense of risking the recovery, which is what anyone really cares about. That's, if you're a politician looking at the 2022 election and worried about that narrow majority in the Senate and holding on to your majority in the House and hoping that you can elect a Democrat again in 2024, you're not taking chances. That's just not what you're doing. I don't know. You're looking at those suburbs.
Well, Joe, I find this to be a very hopeful conversation. So I know we're all, our clients are very, very concerned about this. They're right now they are shaking in their boots. I'm telling you, I hear from clients, they are shaking in their boots about this. I tell them, you know what? It's not the end of the world. Their chances of getting this through are pretty slim. I pretty much say, well, you know what? Probably the worst they could do is raise that top rate to 39.6%. I don't see a whole lot more than that. So, Joe Thorndike, author of Their Fair Share, Taxing the Rich in the Age of FDR. Here we have Taxing the Rich in the Age of Joe Biden. And that's really what we've got. Any final words? If you were a practicing CPA, you were a taxpayer out there, what would you be doing right now?
I would not be that worried. I really wouldn't. I wrote this. I tweeted this out the other day. I really want to introduce the markets to Joe Manchin. I think everyone would be much happier. He is not going to scare you people. He almost became a Republican. I really mean this. I really think it is going to be much more moderate. There are at least four Democrats in the Senate who would make most Republicans feel pretty secure. So I don't think you have too much to worry about.
That means that any one senator in the Democratic side definitely has a lot of veto power there. So,
absolutely. It's President Joe Manchin is what you really should be
so we all need to support him. That's for sure. All right. Well, thank you, Joe Thorndike. Thank you so much for joining us. This is great news. Don't be so worried. This isn't the end of the world. Frankly, I never thought it was. And just remember that when we stay on top of this stuff, what happens is our job with our clients is really to calm them down, to give them some sense of security, let them know that we're on top of things, let them know the world is not ending, despite what Twitter may say. And when we do that, we always end up with better clients, a better practice, and a better life. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks you.
You've been listening to the WealthAbility for CPAs show. Better clients, better practice, better life. To learn more, go to WealthAbility.com.